Hello and welcome to my Ultimate Home DIY alloy wheel refurbishment guide. Here are a few before clips of the wheels. As you can see, they weren't in too bad condition, mainly just a few curb marks around the outside and some paint and lacquer that were coming off in some of the inner areas. And here are the after clips. As you can see, all the curb marks have gone, all the inner areas have all been freshened up. The basic method used is to sand everything down, give it a coat of primer, coat of silver paint and a coat of lacquer. So these are some of the tools and equipment that I've used to complete the job. What I have is a multi-tool with a small sanding disc with a variety of different grits, 120, 240 and a 600. I've also got some wet and dry sandpaper, a 240 grit and a 600 grit, as well as some contour sanding pads and some masking tape. Regarding the paint, I've got some high coat paint. I've got the primer, the silver wheel paint and the lacquer. In regards to quantities for my four wheels, I used just over a can, probably about between 1 can and 1.5 cans of the primer. I used a full 2 cans of silver wheel paint and about 1.5 cans for the lacquer. Price wise for the paint, I got it all off eBay from Motor World and it was around £30. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is clean the inner side of the wheel. We just want to use a rag. It doesn't need to be super clean, but we just want to remove any loose particles, any brake dust that's potentially there, just to stop it coming onto the paint later on. Next up, we just want to take a clean rag and clean the outer side of the wheel. It doesn't need to be perfect here, but we just need it clean enough so we can see all the imperfections. Now the wheel is clean, we can take a look at the condition and you can see it's not too bad. There's just a few curb marks around the outside and a few stone chips. What we can do now is start sanding, and what I like to use is multi-tool, which has a flexi shaft. What I like to do is always start from the same position, which is usually where the valve's located. Speed wise, I tend to like it on a 3 or a 4 setting with this particular model. If it's too slow, you'll get a judder, and it's too quick, you'll take too much off. Grit wise, I'm using a 240 grit here as the damage isn't too bad, but if you find you've got really deep curb marks, you'll probably want to go lower to like a 120 grit. And as far as technique goes, all I'm doing is gently pressing the sanding disc against the wheel and gradually working out the curb marks. And here are the results of the first sanding session. You can see it's still quite rough, and we'll be using some higher grit paper to get that a lot smoother, but you can see the rough edges have all been worked out now. What we want to do now is continue sanding with the multi-tool, but with a 600 grit, and we want to go over the areas we've been over and also areas where it wasn't quite so heavy and just needs a light sand. Now we want to take some wet and dry sandpaper. I'm using a 240 grit here, and they come in big sheets, but I just rip them off to a couple of inch squared. And once we've wet it, we just want to go over the areas we've been over with the multi-tool and just extend the area a little bit, just so it creates a bit more of a smoother surface. And here's a quick clip after the hand sanding. As you can see, it's looking a lot smoother and a lot more worked in. And then doing the same hand sanding just with the 600 grit. A quick after shot here of what it looks like after the 600 grit. You might not notice too much difference, but it is quite a lot smoother. What I like to do next is take the 600 grit and give the wheel an overall sanding. It's best to focus on the inner edges, because what you'll find is that the brake dust sort of builds up there and you'll get a rough surface once it's painted, unless that's sort of sanded down. And the more sanding we do here, the more lacquer that's removed, which means the primer will bond better. You can see here the results from sanding the inner edges. Now we want to take a cutting of a contour sanding pad. This is essentially what you find on the back of your kitchen sponge. And what we want to do is go over the whole wheel. We've already sanded a lot of the wheel, but not every area. We want to make sure that we go over everything, including the top edges, to make sure that it primes better. So now you have your alloy ready for a degrease and priming. You need to be completely happy with the result of all the sanding here, and if there are areas where you're not happy, you really need to go back and address those. What we'll do now is give it a degrease. This is just some bike stuff that I use. We don't want to put too much on, we just want to give it a light spray and then use a J cloth just to clean it off. What I've also got is the wheel raised upon a box, and it just gives some ventilation from underneath. What I'm doing now is taking some cuttings of some masking tape and applying it all around the wheel. Some people choose to use playing cards here, but I like to use masking tape. It may take a little bit longer, but it means that the wheel's more manoeuvrable, and I move it in front of a radiator to help it dry quicker. Then I just take some pieces of paper with some masking tape on the top and just put it around the outer edge of the tyre. What we want to do now is take the high coat primer, and what I like to do is tend to put about 3 coats of this on. I find it sprays easier if you leave it on a radiator or somewhere warm before using it. I take note where I'm starting, which is usually the valve end, and this initial coat is a very light spray. Once that's applied, we need to give it 15 minutes before we put the second coat on. For the second coat, I like to do all the inner edges. And as you can see, I'll start by the valve and just work my way all the way around. I do it like this because I find that if you just apply it to the top, you end up with quite a thick coat on the top and a thinner coat on the inner edges. So after another 15 minutes, I apply the third and final coat of primer. This coat I apply to the top of the wheel. I just work my way up and down each of the spokes. Finally, I just go around the outer edge, just where the masking tape's been, to make sure that's fully primed. After it's dried for 24 hours, this is what it'll look like. You can see now all the imperfections are not visible and it's ready for painting. Now it's time to apply the silver wheel paint. And again, we want to apply 3 coats, leaving a 15-minute gap in between each one. And it's the same as with the primer. The first coat is a light spray all over. The second one applies a coat to the inner edges. And the third one is a more detailed coat up and down the spokes. After 24 hours, you'll have a wheel that looks like this, which is ready for the lacquer to be applied. Finally, we want to apply the 3 coats of lacquer, and this is essentially done in the same way as the primer and the silver wheel paint was applied, with the first coat being very light, the second one on the inner edges, and the third one over the top. I do find the lacquer is the trickiest to apply, mainly because it's more difficult to see where it's actually been applied. You may find it best to leave it an hour once you've applied your 3 coats and just have a look over it, and if you think it needs a little more in certain areas, then apply. After 24 hours you should have a completely dry wheel that's ready to go back onto the car. Finally, thanks for watching, and I hope you find this useful.